Hi everyone, and you're very welcome to another edition of Capricorn Radio with your host, James Swagger. Today we'll be joined by Rand Flemath, but before we do, a few quick announcements. You can check out the Capricorn Radio Facebook group. It's grown to over 2,200 members now. Follow the links on the Facebook page to discuss the topics on the show. Also follow the links on the CapricornRadio.com homepage. Also there you can see the upcoming guests in the Facebook event section. This Friday we have Chris Dunn, which is tomorrow, and Saturday we have Robert Boval. Really looking forward to finishing this week and getting the shout out there. So let me tell you about today's guest before I bring him on. Rand Flemath is a Canadian writer, librarian and independent scholar. He has co-authored several books with his wife and writer Rose Flemath. She's a novelist and two-time winner of the Canada Council Grant for Fiction. They live in British Columbia, Canada. Let me tell you about Rand's education. He's a BA in Sociology and Anthropology from Simon Fraser University and a Master of Library Science, MLS, from the University of British Columbia. He was mentored by Charles Hapgood from 1977 to 1982, working on the theory of Earth crust displacement, something we're going to get into on the show. And he's a reader at the British Library from 1981 to 1985. He was a senior researcher for the Business International UK Limited, incorporated by The Economists. So without further ado, let's bring on our guest for today. Welcome to Capricorn Radio, Rand.
Well, thanks to be here. Nice to be here, James.
Yeah, and we had such a fascinating discussion last time, and just for the listeners, we lost a 2-hour show, but man, we had such a time last time, Rand.
It was a good time. It was not lost as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think we both learned something from each other and came away kind of a bit more enlightened, and that was fantastic in itself. So yeah, here we are again, and I really appreciate you coming back on the show to redo the show because of the lost files. But so let's get into some of your background, Rand. What got you into this? It always puzzles me when people research Atlantis. I go, what got you into Atlantis? What is it? A mystery? Was there some facts laid in front of you, or was there some sort of anomaly that you've seen, or what's your route in to look for Atlantis, and how does it all come about for you? Like
in one weekend, I've told this story many times, and I don't want it to be overemphasized because I only spent one weekend doing this. But I was writing a science fiction script, and I just came up with the idea of putting Atlantis in Antarctica in the science fiction script. Now, I went off to the library and started to do some research about Atlantis, and that's when it turned from being a script into a research project, which I then continued on for decades. And what I found at the library was a map of Atlantis that was in a book created in 1665. Athanasius Kircher, he was a Jesuit priest living in Rome. And he had access to all the loot that the Romans had taken from the Egyptians. So he found this map, and he reproduced it in a book in 1665. And that map, which you often will see, is a map of Atlantis, supposedly in the North Atlantic Ocean. And it's peculiar in the sense that there's a little compass on it that points down, which means that north is down. So you have to turn the map upside down to get our orientation. I came to that map with the concept of, hey, listen, rather than turning the map upside down, maybe we should turn our globe upside down and look at it. And at that time, I came across Charles Hapgood's book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. And in it, for the first time for me, there was a picture of an ice-free Antarctica. And the thing that struck me about it was that Kircher's 1665 map of Atlantis was a remarkably similar map to an ice-free Antarctica. And of course, this is in the book Atlantis Beneath the Ice and on our website under Atlantis in Antarctica. But the thing about it was it seems more than coincidence to me. It seems, because I knew that in 1665, Europeans weren't capable of determining longitude at sea. That didn't happen until the 1770s.
That's the bombshell, Rand. Sorry, Rand. That's the bombshell, isn't it? If this is true, then this is like mammoth. This is a mammoth concept.
Yeah. See, for what it meant to me was that, hey, now there is a piece of physical evidence, this map that Kirker published in 1665, which is a remarkably accurate map of Antarctica without the ice. And we didn't know what Antarctica looked like, even vaguely, about beneath the ice until 1958. That's like 3 centuries after Kirker's book had been published.
That was through radar imaging as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that's using seismic surveys to do it. Now, the maps of Antarctica are getting more and more and more sophisticated.
Sure.
And, of course, you now also have to take into account ocean level as well, because we have a different ocean level now than there was 12,000 years ago when Atlantis was supposed to have existed. So, that was the thing that really got me. It was the Kirker map of Atlantis being what I believe to be an accurate map of ice and ice-free Antarctica. And the south is up is a notion that was common in Egypt. For Egypt, south is the top, ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
We regard the north as up and the south is down. They regarded the south as up because that's where the Nile came from. The water came down from the south to the delta. Mm-hmm. So the top of the world, as far as the ancient Egyptians were concerned, was the south. So south is up. So when you take a globe and start to look at the world from south is up, that is one of the keys to understanding how Atlantis has been lost to us because of our own worldviews and also the worldviews that we are trying to filter through. Our concept of ancient worldviews are prejudiced by our assumption of our superiority. Mm-hmm. And I believe, and this has been the essential thing that I believe about Plato's account of Atlantis, which he himself regards not as his own invention, but as simply as a story that had been passed through his ancestors, who in turn had taken it from Egyptian priests, who in turn had recorded records from survivors of Atlantis. So the story that is told in Plato's dialogues of Timesius and Critias about Solon, who was Plato's ancestor, going 200 years before the time of Plato, but Solon went to Egypt, and he encountered a priest there and got to him talking about the Great Flood and mm-hmm. all the things that had happened in the past. And this priest gives a description. He says, oh, Solon, you Greeks are but children because you remember very little of the ancient past. Mm-hmm. We, on the other hand, have all these records, and some of our records go back 9,000 years. And so that takes us to 9,600 BC because Solon was in Egypt around 600 BC. So 9,600 BC, because that's an important date to remember.
Very
because
important.
A lot happening at that time.
Mm.
In any case, what happened, and here's the interesting thing. The priest, who I through other research, I learned his name was Zonkis, because he was also the tutor to Pythagoras, who was contemporary of Solon. So he taught Pythagoras for 22 years.
Wow.
He had an encounter with Solon when Solon was visiting in Egypt. Well, and that's where the story of Atlantis begins, as far as we know, is that Zonkis tells Solon about Atlantis, and he says, and he tries to describe where Atlantis is to Solon. But Solon's worldview, which is the ancient Greek world, was pretty limited. So he didn't understand what was said, but he was very good at memory, as all the Greeks were at that time, because this is before the times of writing being popular. Really, writing became very popular with Plato and Aristotle 200 years later. The early pre-Socratic philosophers were oral tradition, so they were very good with their memory. So what Solon did is he recorded this description of the location of Atlantis, and in his memory, passed it on to his ancestors, who eventually came to Plato, who was the first to write it down. Now, even Plato, in my view, didn't understand it. He just regurgitated it, if you like. And people have been trying to understand this because there's peculiar notions in it. A real ocean, a whole opposite continent. These are notions that are very, very, very peculiar.
In a way, sorry, Rand, in a way, that's probably not a bad idea that he didn't understand it, because if he was just regurgitating it, he probably would have kept to the facts more than twist or alter some viewpoint that he might have had.
That's my feeling, absolutely. I totally agree with you, James. Without his, it was their very ignorance that allowed us, because what I'm saying and what I have been saying and Rose and I have been saying, and When the Sky Fell, and then also in the Atlantis Blueprint and Atlantis Beneath the Ice, is that this account is the most sophisticated scientific account of the Earth's geography that we have even as of today. Mm-hmm. It is the most sophisticated. In 2 or 3 sentences, that the description of the entire planet's geography is accurately depicted from the point of view of Antarctica. And that's the thing that throws people off, because we can't imagine looking at the world from Antarctica. But once you start to look at the Earth's geography from Antarctica, then everything that is said in Plato's account makes sense, and I can go through that a little bit if you want.
Yeah.
But that's the bottom line about it.
Well, here's the thing. Let's talk about the parameters and the world ocean and the Egyptian link with Solon and how it was recorded down, because it was recorded by the Greeks, and their worldview, Rand, was different to what our worldview is today, or it'll be different to our worldview in another 2,000 years. So let's get into the Greek worldview and what they were trying to record down, and what that actually means in terms of the evidence.
Oh, sure. The main thing to understand about the Greek worldview is, first of all, they believed that the world was a disk.
Sure.
The world was spherical, but the land part of it was in the northern hemisphere and surrounded by water completely, all north, south, east, west. So, all directions. If you went far enough, you would encounter the same ocean, which they called the Atlantic Ocean. Mm-hmm. Now, so the Atlantic Ocean doesn't just refer to the North Atlantic Ocean like we do in our European-centered view. Sure. It also refers to the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Arctic Ocean. It's the whole ocean. Mm-hmm. So inside that disk are 3 subdivisions. There's Europe, which is pretty well contemporary with what would be most of Europe. It's pretty similar to what Europe looks like today in terms of geography. Mm. But then there had 2 other features. They had what was called Libya, which we would call North Africa. So it includes all of North Africa, and it's quite a large area. And then what they called Asia, which today we would call the Middle East. So as far as and to the extreme west, there was the Pillars of Hercules, which is the Strait of Gibraltar. Now that has 2 different meanings to the Greeks. One meaning is the extreme western edge of what we would call the Mediterranean Sea. That's the extremity of it. Sure. And that is, and that's one meaning, and that actual strait there. The other meaning was more of a psychological thing. It was the end of the known world. Yeah, I mean, if you were to go out through those Pillars of Hercules and you didn't know what was out there, that would be daunting, frightening, the unknown back then, Well, the thing about it, and Plato says it, and so does other Greek writers, the poets and stuff, they say, Pender, for example, says, what lies beyond, we know what he knows. Because what happened is that people would go beyond, but they wouldn't come back. So, that was a barrier. So when we say that Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, it doesn't mean it was to the west. Plato never used the word west, or the Sankas never used the word west. He said it was beyond the Pillars of Hercules. In other words, beyond the Mediterranean Sea. And so it could just as easily be in the Pacific as it is in the Indian. Okay, so that's the Greek worldview, and what we have now come to in our present day, in our satellite time, what I would call now a scientific point of view, is that I'm going to skip over the European point of view because people probably think they know that, but we'll discuss that a little bit. But let's go right to what is a really scientific point of view of the Earth's the planet Earth.
Sure.
First of all, it's, mostly water, and it's one ocean.
70%, 70% water, which is a lot.
Yeah, and it's a one continuous ocean. If you take a globe and look at Antarctica and ask yourself what ocean it's in, today, using our European concepts, what we've invented is this Antarctic Ocean, which is simply an imaginary barrier, which is the polar zone around Antarctica. And then it's also in the South Pacific, it's in the Indian Ocean, and it's in the Atlantic. So we're thinking of different oceans, but there is, according to oceanographers, and this is what they teach in oceanography today and have been for 20, 30 years, is that the Earth has but one ocean, the world ocean. And this is interesting because in the account that the Egyptian priest gives of the location of Atlantis, he calls the ocean that Atlantis is in by two names. He says it's the Atlantic Ocean, and he also calls it the real ocean. And he says one other thing about it. He says that the Mediterranean is but a bay of this big ocean, a small bay of this big ocean.
Wow.
And all that is true when you start to look at the Earth's geography from a scientific perspective. And because it's not just oceans, there's only one ocean, but we have, in our European-orientated point of view, we see the world from Europe, and that's the way geography has developed because of history. But, for example, the Middle East. People in the Middle East don't call themselves Middle Easterners. People in the Far East don't call themselves Far Easterners.
Sure.
They call themselves, they're in the Middle Kingdom.
Yeah.
So every place has their own center. And the problem with the European point of view and the history of exploration, which was undertaken by Europeans, is that those perceptions have blinded us to the scientific nature of the description of the location of Atlantis in Plato's account.
Do you know what always bugged me when I was a kid? They talked about Eastern civilization and Western civilization, and I just looked at the globe and I went, well, surely no matter where you stand on the globe, you have East and West, So,
exactly.
So that's what you're portraying.
Well, yeah, it's all arbitrary. It's totally arbitrary. Well, the world is democratically round.
Yes.
The only way to look at the world.
That's the best.
Pardon?
Democratically round is a very good way to portray it. Democratically round.
So the other thing, of course, in this description is a description of the continents, and there's this thing called the whole opposite continent that surrounds the real ocean. So here's just as the Atlantean point of view that Zonkas articulated to Plato's ancestor Solon was of like a dartboard. In the middle is Atlantis. It's an island. There's a couple islands off of it, and then there's this big real ocean, and then surrounding on the edges of this, all the way around this big ocean, is a continuous landmass, one continuous landmass, which they called the whole opposite continent. Now that includes, and you can see this in the book and also on our website under the Atlantis and Antarctica, that includes like South America, North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia are all part of one continuous landmass. So from the geographic point of view, from a strictly scientific point of view, a continent is a continuous landmass. Well, in the time of Atlantis, you could walk from the tip of South America to the tip of Africa and never have to cross the ocean. Mm. So all of those land masses, South America, North America, Asia, Europe, Africa, are continuous in terms of being able to walk them, just as the world ocean is continuous. So fundamentally, from a strictly scientific point of view, and with a southern prejudice, as opposed to a northern prejudice, and because the Atlanteans were a southern hemisphere, and then I can give other reasons why that is the case, but their perspective is very much Atlantis in the middle, a couple of islands off, and then you find this whole opposite continent which encircles the real ocean. So here's I'm just going to read to you the actual words that Plato that Plato wrote. Yeah. When he recorded the words that had once been spoken at 600 BC. And it said that Atlantis was larger than Libya, that's North Africa, and Asia, that's the Middle East combined. So that's exactly the size of Antarctica. Mm. If you see in our map that we can show you that Antarctica is almost exactly the size of North Africa and the Middle East combined. From it, that is from Atlantis, there were passages for seafarers of those times to reach the other islands. These are islands that are now beneath ice. And from them, the whole opposite continent, which surrounds what can truly be called the ocean. For these regions, that is the Mediterranean, that lie within the strait, that is within the Pillars of Hercules, which we were talking about, seem to be but a bay having a narrow entrance. But the other ocean is the real ocean, and the land that entirely surrounds it may be, with the fullest truth and fitness, be named a continent. Those are the words. And beautiful. My claim is that is an advanced scientific account of the Earth's geography as seen from Antarctica as it was 9,600 BC.
And that, like an anthropomorphic projection from somebody from Atlantis, if that is in Antarctica, it's wrote from like an Antarctic viewpoint, if you want to call it that.
That's right, and the thing that made this possible was that there was a U.S. naval support force in Antarctica, and they drew this map from Antarctica, wow. which is also on our website and also in the book. Which shows the reality of the real ocean, the one ocean. Mm-hmm. And they use this map in texts on oceanography to explain to everybody that there is but one ocean, the real ocean. And the rest of the continents do surround it from that perspective. Mm-hmm. So what we're saying here is that there was advanced geographic knowledge of the Earth's entire planet, mm-hmm. encapsulated in 2 or 3 sentences that were put into recorded history, passed from an Egyptian priest to a visiting Greek dignitary, who passed it on to his son, and then his nephew, and then it came to Plato.
What do the Egyptologists think of Solon and the 9600 BC thing, Rand? Are they silent? Does it not exist to them?
Well, the tendency among all of academia today, and I can go into the origins of this, but right now, is that everything is an exaggeration, that Plato's exaggerating. It's not 9,600 BC, it's 960 years ago. Or it's not bigger than North Libya and Asia, it's between Libya and Asia. And, they have to, everything has been And this really started with Charles Lyell, who was the founder of modern geology. Sure. He's kingpin of geology, the grand master, the Darwin of geology. And he begins his book, which was a huge seller in the 19th century, starting out with saying that he's disbelieving the flood, and he thinks that the Bible, it shouldn't be the source, which may or may not be true for our understanding of anything, and that we have to really rely upon what we see in the present and everything, and that all these myths about a great flood are just exaggerations of local events.
I think this Charles Lyell guy would be eating his words today, though, Rand, in all fairness, because there's so many flood myths around the world, and what a time frame for Plato to pick. I mean, he nailed it on the head, this 9600 BC, Rand. I mean, this was...
Well, yeah, this is the thing that again, in addition to giving a scientific point of view of the world from the southern perspective, he pinpoints the time of the Great Flood to 9600 BC, which is commonly regarded today as the end of the Ice Age and the beginning of what we call the Holocene, the end of the Pleistocene and the Holocene. It is the pivotal point in geography and geology that from our modern era. And it's an era of melting ice caps in North America, rising ocean. For 6,000 years the ocean rose, and now it's starting to go down again. But during that first part, there was tremendous flooding. And the Zonkas, again, the Egyptian priest, who had access to the Atlantean records, said that there was an explanation for the Great Flood that is related to the story of Phaeton and the falling sky. And, of course, we go into that quite a bit in our book. The falling sky flood myths are also called the sun deluge myths. And they are around the world, all around the world. Sure. People using different mechanisms, if you like, have the same story, which is there's a change in the sky, most often measured by the sun not going its normal way, or the stars, or the sky falling, and then the flood comes. So the flood is the second event. The first event is the falling sky, or the change in the sun's position of the sun in the sky, and that we, of course, are using the theory of Earth crust displacement to explain that.
Mm. Okay, let's stop there a second, Rand. Right, we're going to get into Earth crust displacement because I think this is important because the book is called Atlantis Beneath the Ice. And we're saying Atlantis is beneath the ice because of the maps. And so let's get Charles Hapgood brought into this point because you corresponded with Charles Hapgood and he had this theory of Earth crust displacement. And it perhaps that Atlantis got shoved into its present position, and that would, if the Earth crust displacement did happen, that would explain why, if you were on the crust and it shifted, it would explain why the sun is in a different position. So let's kind of roll out this theory of Earth crust displacement. It's a good time to bring it in.
Okay, well, Charles Hapgood he went to Harvard. His teaching was interrupted by the Second World War. He also went to university in Germany. He was fluent in German, and he was in Germany during the rise of the Nazis. So when the Second World War broke out, he came back to America and joined the OSS, which was that was what the CIA was known at, Operations of Special Services. They were the first spy agency for the American, and he worked in that department because he had inside knowledge about Nazi Germany.
Sure.
After the war, he got picked up by a couple of different colleges, and he became a professor. And then in the early 50s, he got interested in Atlantis, and by students kept bringing it up in his history of science classes, and so he started to investigate it a little bit, and and through that, he also had a friend, an older fellow, in his good 30 years older than he was, and who was a physicist, and he understood. They first came up with the idea that there must have, what destroyed Atlantis, that's what they were interested in. Their first thought was that it must have been a change in the Earth's axis, that somehow the axis of the Earth changed. And when they started to investigate that, that's when they, of course, began corresponding with Albert Einstein. Now, Albert Einstein recorded his material is recorded flawlessly. Everything that he wrote to everybody has been recorded by his secretary, and it's in their archives. Yeah. So anybody who wants to go into and see whether or not there was correspondence between Hapgood and Einstein can now do that online, and just put in Einstein and Hapgood and Jerusalem, and that'll probably do it. Anyway, this correspondence between Einstein and Hapgood led to him modifying his idea that it wasn't the Earth's axis that shifted, but just simply the outer shell of the Earth, which is called the crust, or the scientists call it the lithosphere. It's all of the outer crust of the Earth. Some parts of it are ocean, some parts of it are continent. Don't think of them as the continents being separate. They're all part of the same shell. Yeah. And the outer shell of this, which is only 1/3 of 1% of the Earth's mass, is shifted. And when it shifts, of course, you move from you might be in a temperate zone and you ended up in a polar zone. Or you might be in a temperate zone and you end up in a tropical zone. Or you could be in a temperate zone and end up in a polar zone. And that's what happened to Atlantis. It was a third of Antarctica, the side, it's called, people now call it Lesser Antarctica. It's still the size of Western Europe. The side towards South America, we contend, was temperate before the last Earth crust displacement, which occurred at 9,600 BC, just as Zonka said it did. And a third of the continent, the other 2/3 was under ice. It was still a white continent, and there are mentions throughout world mythology of the notion of a civilization in the middle of the ocean that was white. Now, Antarctica was white even then, and of course in the winter it would be all white. But in the summer, a third of the continent, and again, this is a huge continent. Don't forget that Antarctica is about the size of the United States. So, it's a big area, and it was temperate. And moreover, it had ocean currents going all the way around it from all directions that would have warmed it. So it would have been warmer than even the latitude. Some of the latitudes that it were like at 55. But, that's like parts of Alaska are like that. Sure, you get winters, but it's pretty mild as well.
Sure. So, I have to say, at this point, Rand, I'm in the north of Ireland, and we're at the same latitude as Labrador in Canada. And we're getting a heat wave now at 27.5 degrees, which is like...
Oh, my gosh.
It's ridiculous for this northerly latitude. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous, like. But Canada and these latitudes can get pretty warm, like.
Absolutely. Well, I live on Vancouver Island on the west coast of Canada, and we don't get snow as a novelty. It's a real novelty. I mean, practically everybody shuts down just to enjoy it because it's so rare. Sure. Okay.
Sure.
So, and I'm at the 49th parallel, so like 2 degrees below London, say. So, we have a mild climate here because of the ocean. The Pacific Ocean is bringing warm water to us. And the same thing was true of Atlantis. And in the Atlantis blueprints, we talk about the Atlantis Channel, which was because the continent and the ocean levels were different. There was a series of islands off of Antarctica, and there was a strait that went between the main part of the continent and these other islands. And that would have brought warm water through there, and that would have made it warmer than even the latitudes indicate.
Yeah, I should just say at this point, I have a copy of the Charles Hapgood's book, The Path of the Pole.
Yes.
And there's a foreword by Albert Einstein in that actual book, the letter from Albert Einstein. And
yes, it is.
Albert Einstein endorsed it. He quite liked his theories, didn't he? And I mean, Charles Hapgood wrote books, the Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings as well. He really delved into this in an academic manner, and I can really understand your correspondence with Charles Hapgood. And I remember you were talking about the time he departed us on this planet, and how that much of an impact it had on you too as well, Rand, because you had a friend.
Yeah, that was very. We had just we were getting into some heavy duty correspondence because
and all of a sudden
I started in 1977 corresponding with him. And then what I decided to do with the Earth crust displacement theory to try to give it credibility was not to say anything about Atlantis because, that's taboo, but to show that theory of Earth crust displacement could be an explanation for the origins of agriculture. And so I researched for a year or two the origins of agriculture, and I showed that the kind of climatic change that was predicted by this Earth crust displacement that Charles Hapgood created in association with Albert Einstein can explain the origins, the geographic location of the origins of agriculture around the world. And I sent that off to an academic journal in Canada. It was Anthropological Journal of Canada. It was the first one I sent it off to, and they made it the lead article.
Mm-hmm.
But then nothing happened.
Sure.
So what? Like it just, even though people, I've shown that this problem, the origins of agriculture, which is
it's all high altitude.
Pretty important to civilization, can be explained, and it's been around for 150 years, people trying to explain it, can be explained simply with this theory of Earth crust displacement.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's all, the origins of agriculture is all at high altitude. It's always at high altitude, and it's like nobody addresses that. And I haven't heard anybody address that like you do. And in fairness, I do say I don't know if you agree with this or not, trying to big you up, but you do have a good continuation of Charles Hapgood. You have carried the flag, you have kept the torch running. You've gone and kept that continuation of Charles Hapgood's research. I don't know anybody else that does that. I don't know anybody else that has that around.
That has been my mission. That's what I have been doing. And the thing that's frustrating, we were talking about learning of his death. I was in London at the time. I was reading at the
British Museum.
The British Museum when the library was still in the museum there.
What a museum that is, Rand, eh?
Well, what a library resource too.
What a library as well, yeah.
When I was living in British Columbia, it took me 6 months to get a rare or odd book. When I was in London, it would take me an hour. It was so I was just reading up the storm when I was there. Anyway, I was supposed to have lunch with Rose because I was expecting this correspondence from Charles, and Rose came up with a letter, and it said return to sender deceased. And I later learned out that he was killed as a pedestrian in an automobile accident. So his last letter to me, he had spoken of the possibility that civilization was much, much older, and that letter was the basis of the Atlantis Blueprint book, which I wrote with Colin Wilson.
Sure.
But it was very, very disheartening to have him die prematurely. Just as our correspondence was really starting to heat up. Sure. But I had corresponded with him for 5 years, so I got a lot out of it, and sure. I do consider him my mentor, and I do consider that I have tried to be his protege. Mm-hmm.
Here's the thing for me, and the Albert Einstein, a lot of people say because the Earth is not spherical, people think as the Earth is it. We see globes on, we see our globes in the house and we spin them and they're all spherically, perfectly spheres. But the Earth is actually an obloid. But here's the thing, I'm from a physics background, and I think this is actually enhancing the Earth's crustal space, not negating it. Because they say, well, if it's an obloid, like a flattened sphere, like flattened at the poles, like, they say that, well, then the Earth couldn't shift around because it's not like the skin of an orange. But if it was the skin of an orange, it could just go totally spinning, like, and it wouldn't stop. But I think the fact that it's obloid, it will shift, but then stop at some point. It's the braking mechanism. That's what I think.
You are absolutely right. That is exactly it. The equatorial bulge acts as a brake upon the displacement. Otherwise, like you say, in space, once something starts moving, there has to be something to stop it. Otherwise, it just continues.
Exactly.
So we would have had this not only a revolving thing that we're going through with the Earth's axis, but we would have also had this other thing happening, going like north-south and south-north kind of thing, as well as east-west happening, and then we would just be in this, like in a spinning ride at an amusement park or something, for
nightmare
continuously.
Yeah. So okay, right. There's other evidence too, and that's what Hapgood got into was this ice sheet problem, because I never got this. Like, there's two camps. There's people say, and I think this is dissipating now, this theory, but like that Antarctica is a million years of ice. There's a million years of ice there. It's been there but like there is ice core samples that, Hapgood was thorough in his research. It wasn't just about the maps, and we haven't got into the maps yet, but there's ice core samples that show sediment from fresh rivers. Like, in other words, rivers were flowing because they have the sediments in the ice, and the sediments can only come from flowing rivers. And there's three types of sediments.
Here's the thing that I agree with all of what you're saying. But here's the thing that I think that really puts it into perspective. We know that every place on the Earth has its antipodes. That is, there's an opposite side of the Earth.
Yeah.
New Zealand is nearly antipodal to the British Isles.
Sure.
A little bit warmer. North Pole, South Pole.
Yeah.
China, South America, North America, South. Yeah. Okay. So opposite to the area that we're talking about in Lesser Antarctica, which is the part towards South America. This is where we think Atlantis was. Opposite to that is Siberia and Beringia. Okay, so Siberia, Alaska, and the landmass that no longer exists, huge, all that area up there. We have extensive Russian scientific and American in Alaska investigations showing that area during the last ice age, supposedly, there wasn't ice. There was all sorts of animals living there. Animals, they call it like large scale, not just the mammoths and mastodons, but deer and antelope and cherry. There's a 90-foot cherry tree found on the New Siberian Islands.
Wow.
So, and these are now well within the Arctic Circle.
And the woolly mammoths, they had the fresh buttercups in the belly, didn't they? That's the big clincher for me. Like, these guys were eating fresh buttercups and got frozen overnight. Yes,
that cannot. These problems. When a problem in science cannot be explained by the prevailing paradigm, they're ignored.
Mm-hmm.
They just ignore them. And until so many of them pile up, that there has to be a breakthrough and a new paradigm comes about. And I believe that Earth crust displacement now is a paradigm shift. And
should be an opportunity, though, Rand, shouldn't it? I mean, when problems arise, you have two ways of looking at it: ignore it, or you see it as an opportunity to change, an opportunity to evolve, change, enlighten, turn that problem around, and use it to your advantage. You know, that's what it should be. That's a human trait to do that.
I think anomalies are signposts to discovery.
Exactly, Rand. Exactly.
And if you ignore them, you can just stay on the main highway.
Yeah.
But if you see an anomaly off the main highway, and it's a real problem, then follow it, because it's going to lead you to a discovery. If I could say one thing to anybody who really wanted to understand how science really operates, and this is something that Einstein emphasized again and again, and he did personally to Hapgood, it's curiosity. Keep your mind curious. Look for things that don't fit. Who cares about the things that fit? Things that fit are, okay, that's done. Let's look at the things that don't fit. Because when we look at the things that don't fit, I have on our website I have a section called Bits That Don't Fit. and you know, it's just about things that don't fit the prevailing notions of what science is or isn't. You know, if you don't have curiosity and you're not willing to chase those anomalies, then all you're going to get is regurgitation of what has happened before. You'll get refinements, and sure, but you won't get breakthroughs. And this is why, when you look at Thomas Kuhn, who is the most famous sociologist of scientists, he wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And the reason he said that so many of the scientific revolutions have occurred by people who weren't taught in the discipline in which they made their discovery was because they didn't have the fixations of that. They weren't indoctrinated into the paradigm, and then that indoctrination. Einstein said another thing: I don't know how curiosity survives the education system. You know, so like this is it. Anomaly, anything that doesn't work. Or seems
why
odd
is a great
about
question, Rand? I always teach my nephews, and one niece, and I always say, always ask the question why. I drum it into them, because why gives you the answers. Like, yeah, why is this? Why is that? I love to see kids asking the question why, because it's a sign of intelligence, it's a sign of curiosity, as you say. The best question of all, if you ask me.
And again and again, the big scientific breakthroughs occurred not by people who were taught in the field, but people who came from outside the field and looked at the situation like a child, afresh. Rand,
let's get into some of these maps, because this is the real, juicy stuff for me as well, because
okay, sure.
The maps are absolutely astounding. These are jaw-dropping because they're like, tangible evidence. And let's just explain for the listeners, Rand. Cartography is a very high science, is it not? It's like, it's advanced, there's so much in it. Like you say, the U.S. Naval have took some of these, the cartographic section have taken some of these maps and come up with some very startling results.
Absolutely. First of all, people don't have to. It's easy enough to understand latitude. You point at the sun and you measure. You can guesstimate the angle, and so like where I am, I'm at the 49th parallel. So the sun, is near the 49th, an angle of 49 degrees. So doing north-south, that's an easy thing. You can do that anywhere. You can do that at sea.
Yeah.
But east-west, being able to turn longitude, that's a function of being able to know the time at one place and then the location where you are, and then to calculate the distance difference. And that's why the British Board of Longitude offered a fortune
£20,000 Rand in.
Yeah, it was a fortune in those days.
Yeah.
For somebody to come up with a way to calculate longitude at sea.
Mm.
And it wasn't really achieved. Well, the first person, Captain Cook in the 1770s, was the first one who actually started mapping the world in South America and west coast of British Columbia and Hawaii and all these other places with a marine chronometer. This is a very sophisticated timepiece. You cannot lose seconds, and even today, the U.S. Navy, in the event of all the satellites being knocked out, the GPS is gone and everything, they have these little clocks, Sure. And if they can't lose a second over a year, because if you lose a second, you can be that's the difference of miles in distance. So the precision of these marine chronometer that was eventually created, and that whole story of longitude is a great, fascinating story. There's a book called Longitude that anybody who's interested in that should probably read. It's a very short book, and it's very good. But anyway, being able to map continents requires a certain level of sophistication, and that level of sophistication in the modern time wasn't reached until the 1770s. So these ancient maps, which are accurate within half a degree of longitude on many, many points of the parts of the continents that they're showing, like South America, subglacial Antarctica, Europe, Africa, even parts of Asia, they are all within, many points are accurate within half a degree of longitude. And some of them are even less than that, like a quarter of a degree of accuracy. So the level of sophistication to be able to draw maps of that level requires a certain amount of technological advancement. And so we can say that the ancient people who drew these maps, and these maps have been in print, in books, in the 16th century, a century before the marine chronometer was being used. Like I say, the Kirker map of Atlantis was published in 1665. The Piri Reis map is 1513.
Yeah.
So they're like 2 centuries ahead of the technology required to create maps like that.
And just for the listeners,
and we know it's not the ancient Egyptians or people that are doing that. It's got to be something with more sophisticated technology.
Sure. Just for the listeners, Rand, the marine chronometer is the device that the British invented, and it takes in the roll, and it works because of the roll and pitch of a ship. A pendulum's clock's not going to work, so pendulums are no good on ships. But so this marine chronometer was able to, go to sea basically, and that's what was invented. I think we talked last time, Rand, and I quite like this, and I had another guy on the show. I didn't quite agree with some of the stuff, but I was telling him as well about this Tanawa, this device called a Tanawa that the Africans had, and when they were at sea, they were able to have. Now the problem with this is you need to have very advanced moon calculations, but they could have used the moon as a reference point and got longitude that way. Now it's a different way of doing it. It's more intuitive knowledge. They obviously didn't have a technological device. All they did was measure the angle to the moon, but if you knew where the moon was going to be over its 19-year cycle, and you'd need to have moon tables. You'd need to know all this. So yes, that makes it more complicated. But hey, it's another method, and there's evidence that this Tanawa device existed to map longitude.
I think this is entirely true. I think that this is exactly possible. However, I should note that nobody applied to collect the 20,000 pounds using that technique, and nor successfully acquired the money by doing that. So yeah, that is theoretically in 2020 hindsight. That is it is true that if you can look back and say they could have, had they known this, then they might have seen this, and that's true. It's true. It's absolutely true. you can, if you have extremely sophisticated knowledge of the movements of the stars and the moons, you can use astronomy to calculate longitude. But it requires immense amounts of observation and continuous over centuries. It's not just like a decade or two. You need centuries of calculations to be able to really have the kind of accuracy that would be required. Incidentally, just speaking of that, I believe that, and this is a startling article, maybe startling, but I believe that Carthage was once the site of a very ancient civilization.
Really?
And much more older than the Carthaginians, because it was at before the last crustal displacement, it was at 30 degrees latitude, which is exactly what Giza is today.
Right.
Okay, and not only that, but as you looked east towards the rising sun, you also had the Mediterranean. So you had a mirror effect on the sun rising and the stars happening. So it was, I believe, an ideal location for astronomical observation before 9,600 BC. And then the people who survived from the catastrophe that occurred from that material, if it was taken to anywhere else in the world at 30 degrees, like Giza, all the astronomical evidence that you had gathered prior to would be valid in the present era, where the rock crust had ended up. So that's just a side note.
Yeah, just on isn't there a map? I can't remember which one it is now. I think it's they show that Cyan is and the Tropic of Cancer can be calculated, and this anthropomorphic projection that we have centered on Greenwich Mean Time, it's the center of all our maps. That when you take the anthropomorphic projection of another map, it shows that Cyan, the Tropic of Cancer, could be calculated how much it drifted, and they can actually date these maps when they were actually originally drawn up.
Yeah, that's what we did do in Atlantis Beneath the Ice, and I think we were the first to do that with that. Although I did do it in a paper for an online journal a few years back. What it is because, like you say, the Earth's tilt, say 23.5 degrees. It goes through a cycle, goes down to 21.8, goes up to 24.4. At the time of the last displacement, it was at its greatest, 9,600 BC, at the time when there was this displacement. It was at 24.4. That is its maximum tilt. Today, it's declined down to 23.5, and it continues to decline. It will continue to decline for several thousand more years now until it gets to 21.8, and then you go back up again. So this is a very slow cycle. It takes 41,000 years to complete the cycle. But the point about it is that there's discrepancy when Charles Hapgood was trying to find the center of what's called the Peary-Reese map.
Yeah.
He thought it might have been San, which is present-day Aswan, which was very close to the Tropic of Cancer, and so he couldn't determine which it was. And I realized that the drift of the Earth's tilt it can be measured in terms of the seconds, the distance between the Tropic of Cancer now and when it was last over a Sen can be calculated out to an exact date. And that's what we did in Atlantis Beneath the Ice, and that's like
3775 BC, I think it was the last.
That's
one.
Right. Yeah.
That blows me away, Rand. That just blows me away, because you look and you go, well, you can get so much information out of a map, and this is what I'm talking about. The tangible evidence is there. You just need to know the science of cartography. It's all encoded in the map. You know, there's a high science there. You don't just draw a couple of continents on a map and hopefully you get it to look right. It's much more than that. There's so much science in it.
And the other thing that's interesting is the projection itself is what's called an azimuthal equidistance projection. this is the kind of thing that the Americans used and the Russians used in the Cold War. They would take Moscow, for example, and they'd make that the center of the world, and then they would create a map around Moscow so they could see where's the closest place I could get to Moscow that is in my territory, which turned out to be Turkey, hence the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so those maps, which are sort of orientated towards satellite knowledge of the Earth's geography, this sort of seeing the world from one spot on the Earth. That was what was some of these early maps had used as a projection. The Urry map, which is the most famous one in Charles Hapgood's maps of the ancient sea kings, is of this nature, and it is only partial. It's a part of it. It shows the eastern side of South America, parts of the Caribbean, parts of Africa, parts of Europe, and that's all it does. But the original map on which it is based, that projection would have gone all the way out to the rest of the world. And that's what the opening chapter of Atlantis Beneath the Ice is about, is when it's called Memorandum for the President, which is a memorandum that Charles Hapgood wrote for Eisenhower. And Eisenhower acted on it, trying to find and locate the original map of the world that Columbus might have used in his voyages to the New World. Fascinating.
You think Charles Hapgood was up against it in terms of trying to shake a paradigm? Was he meeting deaf ears? I know he had Eisenhower and Einstein on his side, but was he successful in his day in his theories, Rand?
Well, people, especially if you look on the web, will poo-poo him and everything and his achievements and diminish Einstein, etc., and that's all ridiculous. Because it wasn't just him, and as we show on our website too, was Albert Einstein silly? And if you follow through that, you can see also that in addition to Einstein, there was the most famous geologist of his era, whose name is Curtly Mather. He was the most prominent geologist. He was in the Department of Geology at Harvard University. He was the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He was elected 4 times to be the president of the American Academy of Arts and Science, and he was the guy who helped, who stood up to Joseph McCarthy. He prepared the geological deposition for Clarence Darrow in the Scopes monkey trial. So this is the guy, and he was, if you've heard of Stephen Jay Gould, who was a wonderful writer who's now deceased, but wonderful Harvard professor and popular writer of science, his mentor. So this Curtly Mather is not a nobody, and he also wrote, and his stuff is in the maps, past the poll, about supporting Hapgood's theory. And I've also acquired information from other sources, which I will be publishing in the future, about meetings that Hapgood had with, particularly one meeting that Hapgood had with about 15 to 20 prominent scientists, a private meeting he had with them, and we have notes. We have acquired the notes from that meeting.
Beautiful.
And they were, and this is the mid 50s, and they were talking about global warming at that time.
Wow.
And that they were taking absolutely seriously what Hapgood was saying. So Hapgood was ahead of his time, and he's probably way too far ahead of his time. I do think that.
Very smart guy, Rand. Very intelligent, like this guy.
he was a lovely person as well. You know, he was a gentle person. He grew flowers, and he was big into his gardens. And then he stopped growing gardens because his guests keep wanting to cut them, and he couldn't stand the idea of the flowers being cut. and when the ants and insects came in, he just, tried to lead them away to different areas. He never killed anything, and he was a very gentle person.
Wow.
And a very generous person in terms with his time, especially with me. I mean, I was honored to have that correspondence with him. And so, the guy has been mischaracterized. He's been poo-pooed. They try to throw Earth crust displacement into what's called pole shift theories.
Yeah.
And technically speaking, you could, it's really marginal to call Earth crust displacement a pole shift. Because the pole doesn't shift. It's the crust that shifts.
Yeah.
So the axis remains stable in an Earth crust displacement.
The thing about half-grid theory is it solves so many problems, Rand. It solves so many things.
The placement of the ice sheets, for one thing.
Yeah.
How did they get in? Yeah, where they were. Why weren't they in Alaska and Siberia while they were in New York and Michigan,
sure.
For example?
That's amazing. Maybe just explain that, Rand, a little bit better. That hasn't been explained by or addressed by anybody in the mainstream community.
Well, here's I think the biggest elephant in the room is, where is the greatest glaciation on the planet? Okay, 90% of the world's glaciation is on Antarctica.
Mm-hmm.
In the northern hemisphere, 90% of the glaciation is on Greenland. Now, Greenland and Antarctica receive less snow than the Sahara Desert receives rain in the areas of the thickest ice. So nothing in the present paradigm, which is the present is the key to the past, that is the mantra of uniformitarianism, the prevailing doctrine of geologists, nothing can explain the fact that the greatest ice sheet in the northern hemisphere and the greatest ice sheet in the southern hemisphere, which are antithetical to each other, are polar deserts. How did the ice get there? And they can't explain it. But Earth crust displacement can. It becomes simple. Once you put the crust in a different position, then you get different rainfall and snowfall patterns. And in a place like Greenland and western greater Antarctica, in the former positions of the Earth's crust over the last 3 displacements, would have received massive amounts of snow. So the snow fell, and it is ancient, and that makes it seem older than it is, because it hasn't fallen since. Because it's not falling. It's not really. It's only accumulating in Antarctica on the part that was Atlantis. The 2/3 of Antarctica where 90% of the world's glaciation is not receiving snowfall. Almost all the snowfall in Antarctica is on that side towards South America. That's the side that we say that was once temperate. So the snowfall is covering Atlantis. Atlantis is beneath the ice, but Antarctica, the whole continent itself, to explain the glaciation of our planet, here's another way of looking at it. If you came to this planet from outer space, and you saw glaciation that was antipodal and lopsided relative to the pole, that would tell you one thing. Hey, this crust must shift.
Yeah.
It must be
it's not balanced.
Periodically shifting.
Yeah,
that's what you would conclude. And indeed, that's what they did conclude about Mars, on that using that idea of antipodes.
Exactly. Okay, Rand, this is what I like about you. You're a prolific researcher, and I know you're at this since 1977, but I can see you blossom through your works and your books. And, this is the thing, this Atlantis Beneath the Ice book is it's prolific because you're going into historical accounts, agriculture, cartography, earth crust displacement, and we haven't touched on yet, but you've also gone into mythology and linguistics. So
yes.
perhaps tell us some about I could talk all day just about the crust displacement and all the other little bits of evidence that make sense, and maybe we'll touch on a couple more, but the mythology and the linguistics is beautiful for me too, and the Haida and Samaria link as well. Tell us about that, Rand.
Haida Gwaii is a island in British Columbia, just south of the Alaska Panhandle. It's in Canada. It's quite a ways away from the mainland, and it's the home of the Haida. And they have lived there, we know, for probably more than 10,000 years. And they have a mythology, a tale that of a former great village that existed before the sky fell, and their story is almost identical in what the motifs that are put together. Motifs in mythology is an icon, if you like, or one idea, like the sky falling, or the flood coming, or the king that survives in a boat. They have this sequence of events that is almost identical to the Sumerian story of the destruction of their original homelands, which they called Dilmun, which was an island in the ocean. And when they say ocean, they're talking about what we would call the Indian Ocean, which is really just simply a part of the world ocean. And so it's to the south. So, of course, Antarctica is to the south. Anyway, the story that is told in the Sumerian tales, and this is the earliest civilization that we have, that we know recorded, is that the sky god conspired with the flood god to destroy mankind, but to save somebody. And that story is exactly told the same way in amongst the Haida. So I was interested in that, and I was trying to find if there was any other relationship between the Haida and the ancient Sumerians. I mean, because this is a long way distance. Like, we're talking about Iraq and British Columbia. This is a long way.
Yeah.
That half a continent, half a globe away.
Sure.
So I came across a Russian linguist who claimed that the Haida language, which has never been successfully pigeonholed into any group, they try to push it into a couple of them. They're always having problems with it. And it's sort of like shoehorning it into something that else is happening, and that because it's so peculiar. But this Russian linguist, whose name escapes me at the moment, believed that this ancient Sumerian and Haida have a lot of commonalities. So now you've got a mythological link. They're telling the same story about the flood, how it happened, and what happened after it. And you've got these linguistic connections. So I happen to be a librarian, and I live on Vancouver Island, and the Haida Gwaii is part of the Vancouver Island Regional Library. And I was the extension librarian, and I would fly 4 times a year up to Haida Gwaii. I'm a flying librarian at the time, and meet with people there. And I met a lot of people that were Haida and heard their stories, and so I had direct experience of them. And one of my good friends, his name is Gwaii. It's not the same as Haida Gwaii, but it's Gwaii. It's spelled slightly different. It means for sun as opposed to islands.
Sure.
He and his brother suffer from this relatively rare form of arthritis. It's called ankylosing spondylitis, AS for short.
Sure.
And among it's genetic. It has some properties that are pretty interesting. One of the things is that immunity is great. from other diseases. However, it itself can be debilitating because your bones start to fuse in parts like at your pelvis and at your neck.
Wow.
You're bent over a little bit. You might go blind.
Wow.
So they have all these blind poets, telling the stories. And this is also true. So I started to look, where is this ankylosing spondylitis as a disease? Because, when I traced it all over the world, and it's really fascinating because here there's quite a bit. First of all, one of the highest concentrations among the Haida. They have a lot. There's some in New Guinea. There's some other parts of British Columbia along the coast. Then there's some in Scandinavia, and there's some in the area of the Middle East, in the area where the Sumerians were.
Wow.
So and there's vast areas in between where that doesn't occur. Like there's nothing in South America. There's nothing hardly any in Asia.
No transmission of the there doesn't seem to be no transmission through geography.
Not through land. Yeah, it would have to be through boats. Mm. So, and also the Haida were and they are most famous for their boats, their cedar canoes. Wow. They were the dominant First Nations in terms of they were invulnerable because nobody could get to them. They were on these islands that nobody even knew where they were, but they could attack other places, you see. So they were raiders and they had slaves and everything.
Sure.
But the main thing about it is, at one point, the Sumerian elements who had the ankylosing spondylitis took over Egypt, and then the pharaohs, particularly Ramses the Great, the most famous of the pyramid of the pharaohs, he had ankylosing spondylitis. So bad, his neck was so crinched that they had to break his neck to get him into the coffin.
Wow.
So we have, it seems to me, mythological, linguistic, and genetic links between the Haida of British Columbia and the ancient Sumerians of the Middle East. And because they have a common ancestor in Atlantis, some of them escaped in the flood.
Ancient transoceanic contact in a way, but possibly a common source. That's what I always say. There's ancient transoceanic contact between ancient cultures, but then there's also this common source as well. The common source concept of Atlantis explains everything. That it was like perhaps they went in both directions from the world ocean, yeah? One to Siberia.
That's it.
Fascinating. I often think about the megaliths you see, and I researched the megaliths, Rand. Of course, you've done a book review for me, but I talk.
Yes, it's a terrific book.
Yeah, and something I'm doing a sequel on, but I fascinates me with this ancient transoceanic contact, and I keep saying that Sligo Bay and Carnac Bay, they're two landing bays. They're just natural landing bays, and of course they both face the Western Atlantic, and there seems to be exactly the same thing. Two peaks, 5000 BC, a wave of megalith buildings, not very much, but then another wave comes in 3000 BC. And there's a sunken landmass off the coast of Ireland in Porcupine Bank. Now, there is other stuff in the Azores Plateau as well. And, it all gets explained by rising sea levels, that. And then perhaps that's why they came in waves, the megalithic builders, like.
And the same thing is true on the west coast of North America. In the book, we show the land that's over 1,800 meters, and on the extremities of that land, that high land mass, are four mountains, and Mount Shasta, Mount Rainier, etc. Sure. And each of those mountains have a story that they were the Mount Ararat of their time. This is where people landed at the time of the flood.
Of course, you would go to high ground in a flood, wouldn't you? That's the most natural thing to do, and then that also enhances the agricultural high altitude too, Rand.
Well, yes, absolutely. And another way of looking at it is that if you're not in highland, you're underwater. So there's nothing left for you to say.
Yeah.
It's over.
Sure. Let's talk about the Aymara language, because this one is fascinating for me, Ron. This is bizarre, and you were talking. I could sit and talk about this for hours, I think. And I have this linguistic guy sitting with me at the moment, and he's like, "Really? They were able to decode it in like binary language?" So.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, let's get where the Aymara are.
Yeah.
They're in an area of the Andes. Lake Titicaca is the center of their culture, and it's the highest freshwater lake in South America, and it's the site of some very ancient megaliths, Tiahuanaco, and it's also there's all sorts of myths there about people coming from the south at the time of the flood and arriving there, and they apparently had some sort of a golden wand of some sort, and this wand was like some sort of a beacon thing of some sort, and they followed this beacon until it stuck in the ground, and that turned out to be Cusco. And we believe in the Atlantis Blueprint. We believe that that was the site of a cache or, a national revival place, if you like, an Atlantean pit stop, if you like, or some place where they left a bunch of stuff in case of a catastrophe, and they had a beacon to get there. Okay, so these are the people who have this very peculiar language, and this language is pure. There are no exceptions to its grammatical rules. And when I came across this when I was still in London, actually, and it was an article in the Times about this language that experts are saying is an artificially created language, and that there is a fellow, and he still is continuing on with this, who is using this language because it fits so perfectly with computers that it can become a universal translator. And it can, so you take English and you put it into this Aymara in the computer, and then it comes out in Portuguese or Arabic or whatever you want. So it's kind of a bridge language because of its purities and the lack of its ambiguities.
Wow.
So my feeling is that, there's no way of proving this, but it seems as though the Atlanteans had computer science, and that they had evolved their computer science with their language. Even now, our language is starting to change because of computers, but they may have had like centuries of that.
Sure.
And so that could have become like a Latin of its time, if you like, of a universal way of speaking with everybody. This was a common language, and it survived in the Lake Titicaca area among the Aymara.
Even like computerized thought, if you want to call it that. This language is like computerized thought, and that it's grammatically checked with a yes, a no, and a maybe, and that's just like binary logic in a way, because we have a yes on. No is off, and a maybe is like can swing either way, is undecided, and it's just like a binary language in a way.
Well, it's actually trilateral.
Sorry, not binary.
Yeah. It's three, and that I was on another radio show, and somebody at Microsoft phoned up and said, "Oh, that's where our research is going."
Really?
Trilateral, like rather than binary, but tri. Yes, because the element of uncertainty. And then there's degrees of uncertainty as well in the language. So when you actually say any sentence in Aymara, it also tells you, just by the structure of the grammar, how sure you are of what you're saying.
Wow.
Yeah. So like, I dreamt it is one thing, or somebody else told me, at secondhand, or I saw it, or it's, we all saw it, that kind of thing. So that even...
Sorry, Ron, what did the Aymara say about all this? Do they just have this in language and don't think about it, or is this being analysed from outside, or...?
Well, the thing about it is that there's a great deal of poverty in
right.
South America still. Right. All of South America was incredibly decimated by the smallpox when the Spaniards came, and the cultures lost a lot. And then they were, of course, all their stuff was stolen, and their documents were burned, and their culture was lost, and they're not in a good state yet. However, it is my belief that sooner or later some of these Amera guys are going to start to get good education, and then they're going to get computers, and then they're going to start doing things with computers that we can't have imagined right now. Mm-hmm. Because if you can think like an American, then you can think like a computer.
Exactly.
In a way that we can't in our cultures.
And don't they say, Rand, as well, don't they say when you speak two languages that if you learn two languages as a kid, you automatically, for mathematics and everything else, other sciences, that you can think in two different ways. Your thoughts, you're a bilateral thinker because you speak bilingual.
I'm sure that's true. I'm not one of those, but I certainly believe that is true. And the thing about this Amara is that it's so, the syntax is so pure. Like we have so many exceptions in English, which is probably one of the great languages in the world, simply because of its scope and flexibility.
Sure.
But in terms of actual precision and there's another interesting thing about the Amera, the way they conceive of the past and the future. They believe that we're backing into the future. Not facing into the future. We're backing into the future because we can see the past and know where we've been, but we can't see behind us, which is the future.
Wow.
And so, yeah.
That's an awesome mindset, isn't it?
It is. It's a very different mindset, and that's the kind of thing that is, that we need, is this shake-up of our assumptions.
Perspective. That's a beautiful perspective there. I like that.
Well, it's, backing into the future, we certainly don't know where we're going. That seems to be the case.
Sure.
And we can't even accurately see where we've been. And as we more accurately see where we've been, we are better able to see where we will go. Mm-hmm. So that's why a paradigm change about what our human history is so important to our future. Is not just by changing the assumptions of what we believe to have happened in the past. Mm-hmm. We are able to open up doors that we're not now perceiving to our future.
Sure. So these Aymara guys aren't far from Tiwanaku, and of course, I'm into archaeoastronomy. I follow the work of Arthur Poznański. So Poznański, you're familiar with Poznański and his ideas? Obviously, yes. Because this enhances your date and time and locale as well.
Yes, he is also saying that. And there has been various datings of that, and it's not at all settled. However, Poznański was a Polish astronomer. He was accomplished in what he did, and he applied what he knew about astronomy to the site on Tiwanaku, and he was able to, by the changes of the Earth's axis, etc., be able to calculate a date. And that date goes back to around the time of the destruction of Atlantis. Subsequently, other people have tried to do that, and they've come up with 2 or 3 different answers. But one of them is always around the time of Atlantis.
Mm. Yeah, I think in Poznański's day, the accuracy of his measurements might not have been as good as we can do today, but I think the ones that we do today is more accurate, and it's actually more fitting to the time of Atlantis.
Yes. which brings us to Göbekli Tepe.
Oh, what a sight, Rand! This is a real little hotbed at the moment, isn't it? Göbekli Tepe.
Well, to me, this is the biggest archaeological discovery of all time.
Me too, Rand. Me too.
I don't think that only the actual discovery of a civilizational remains on Antarctica will top it.
Please God that happens, Rand. Please God that happens.
But right now, the Göbekli Tepe is the main show, and for the people who don't know a little bit about it, at the same century that Zonka said that Atlantis was destroyed in this incredible flood, the same century, 9,600 BC, up pops in the middle of this. It's in Turkey near the Syrian border. These structures, 18 feet high, T-shaped pillars made out of stone, requires incredible masonry to be able, not to mention the whole question of moving them.
Sure.
And now that they're dating it to exactly that time, and right within 100 miles of a parameter, if you put Göbekli Tepe in and then you draw a 100-mile diameter around it, you're going to hit a lot of the most ancient, earliest sites of agriculture in the world.
Yeah, this agriculture at a high altitude again, yeah? Yes.
And quite often multitudes of not just one plant or something, but wheat, barley, sheep, pigs, rabbits, this kind of thing, like happening at the same time.
And 15 miles from the Iraqi border as well, right, from Sumer.
Yeah, not that far. So, to me, the German archaeologists who are doing this right now have come up with a theory that Göbekli Tepe was some sort of temple. That's why it's called a temple, and it was a religious site, and that's what drew all the people to it. And since the density was so high, because up until this time, hunters and gatherers, maybe 100 people, 200 at the most, right? Suddenly you have 500 or 600 or 1,000 people, and now you need more food than you can hunt, so you turn to agriculture. That's their theory.
Yeah.
My feeling is, however, that these are survivors from Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
They have the masonry skills required to make the stones in the first place.
And artistic as well, Rand, and the artistic skills expressed on these T-shaped megaliths.
Oh, the
carvings
that are drawn on
sculptors as well. I mean, extremely artistic expression as well. So evolved is what I'm saying, and highly expressed and advanced and evolved.
Absolutely, and the thing that happens that's so interesting about it is that the earliest ones are the most sophisticated, and as time goes by, they become less sophisticated. It seems as though you have a sudden insertion of advanced masonry skills, who would then over a period of time degenerate because the original engineers, if you like, die out. That's what happens there.
Yeah, I always talk about like this megalithic, because I love the megaliths, Rand, but I always talk about megalithic devolution, that these guys imitated and mimicked what was going on before, but they had less science as they progressed. So they digressed. There was a devolution in the design and style and knowledge, and from a lost civilization, perhaps. They probably got decimated in the flood and only had a certain numbers to try and kickstart it again. And what you see is a devolution in the megalithic empire, and that goes back to probably Göbekli Tepe. Like, you see a very highly sophisticated and advanced and devolving all the way through.
Yes, that is exactly, and that fits exactly with the idea of the last gasp of an advanced civilization.
Yeah, the last gasp, exactly, Rand. It's like, I think we're looking at fragments, Rand. We're looking at fragments of an empire that just survived against the odds. Now, they didn't survive and become what they were again. They just survived, is what I'm trying to say, you know.
I think their greatest legacy to us, though, was the introduction of agriculture.
Yeah.
Because that seems to have happened simultaneously in Lake Titicaca area with potatoes and
yeah, exactly.
All throughout the Middle East, and that fits perfectly with the climatic model proposed by earth crust displacement. Incidentally, just there is a crescent that goes from North Africa all the way to China, and then from India back to the North Africa, which includes the Minoan civilization, the Egyptian civilization, the Sumerian civilization, the Chinese civilization, and the Indian civilization. All of them in this one vast crescent, which I mentioned in my article in the Anthropological Journal of Canada, as I called it the macro crescent, is an area that had been tropical and turned temperate, and immediately to the north of it was an intertemperate zone. So there was plants and animals in the intertemperate zone that survived, and then they migrated into the newly temperate zone, and that's where agriculture occurred. And agriculture is occurring along that line, all the way from Turkey to China, and including India, and also extending down into Egypt. So again, earth crust displacement is explaining the whole thing as one global phenomena.
Sure, you know, this is what I love about your work, Rand. You're tying in so many threads of evidence on many levels, not just this matches up with this. It just all synchronizes together. The historical accounts, the agriculture, the cartography, earth crust displacement, mythology, linguistics. That's quite a wealth of stuff to tie together there, Rand, but it's done beautifully, and it just keeps getting like referenced in other parts of the world. It's like it all roads head back to Atlantis.
I think so. Yeah, I do think that they do, and of course we didn't talk so much about the Lost Island Paradise motif, but there is that as well throughout the world. Because when I was studying the flood myths, I paid particular attention to two different motifs. One was the falling sky or moving sun, the sun veering from its normal path. That was one thing that occurred before the flood, which I think was explicable by the earth crust displacement theory. The other thing was this existence of an advanced civilization that existed before the flood. And that is not quite as frequent, but it is very clear. And I'd like to give you an example, three examples that are very interesting because they all have the same sound pattern when they refer to the lost civilization. And that sound pattern is da-da-da-da-da-da, just like na-na-na-na-na-na.
Sure.
And here it is. Among the, we'll start in Japan, Onogoro-jima. That is the original island home of the Japanese that was believed to be near the pole and was created by the two, a god and goddess, as they spun the earth and caused it to revolve on its axis. And as they brought their great vast spear out of the ocean, bits of droplets fell close to the pole and formed islands, and that means Onogoro-jima is the island of the congealed drop, the regional homeland of the Japanese people. That's their lost civilization. Then we go to the Vedic tradition. It's in India, but I'm going to refer to the Iranian version of the Vedic literature, the Vendesta. Anyway, we'll get to the name of the lost paradise is Ariana Dejo. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Now, it is, again, an island in the middle of the ocean that is destroyed not just by a flood, but by a dire winter that covers the original homeland in snow and ice.
Wow.
So that's Onogoro-jima. Ariana Dejo. And then you go to British Columbia again. This is another area in the interior of British Columbia, in the Rockies, still in British Columbia. There's the Okanagan, and they have Suma Tui Hula, Dada Dada Dada, and it was an island paradise in the middle of the ocean that was associated with whiteness. So when you take all those three together, and there's no known association between the Japanese and the Okanagan, or the Okanagan and ancient Iran, or ancient Iran and Japan, when it goes back to mythology. However, they're all referring to their lost island paradise destroyed by a flood as being with a sound pattern that goes da-da-da-da-da-da.
Fascinating. Funny you mentioned the Japanese there. I wanted to mention to you earlier and I'd forgot, but there's links with the Japanese Ainu and the Basque region of Spain. And the Basque people there are just like they're dropped out of somewhere else. They're different noses. They have a long aquiline nose. The skin is slightly more reddish. Their eyes are different. They look totally different. They speak a different language. But the structure of the Basque language is very, very similar to ancient Japanese Ainu, and nobody can explain this. Perhaps, again, I always look to this common source for these anomalies, and I think that's something else as well. It's largely been unaddressed as well. Of course, there's a lot of influence with the Basque and modern Spanish, and they seem to be getting a bad time of it, and they're almost being, culturally wiped out by influences, other cultural influences, but they do resist, and they are so different and so bizarre. They call them Atlanteans almost. They do actually refer to them as Atlanteans, these Basque people around.
That's it. That is fascinating, and I've always been interested in the Anu as well, because they don't physically resemble the rest of the Japanese population either.
Wow. Yeah. Perhaps a common thread, Rand. This is the thing, it's so vast, Rand, isn't it? We're talking global events here. And the reason I think, and that's what I like about Atlantis Beneath the Ice, that's why we're talking on a global scale, because as you look at Antarctica as the center of projection, you go in all directions all around the globe. It's why we're talking a global phenomena here.
Absolutely. Even Australia. The interesting thing about Australia is that some of the oldest sites in Australia are in the southeast corner of Australia.
Wow.
We're not coming in from the northwest,
but in
the southeast. Yeah, some of the oldest sites there are there, and you can't help but wonder whether or not there was some sort of Atlantean influence there. The disadvantage Australia had was not a lot of high land, and so, there are other anomalies like New Zealand, which does have highland. Doesn't seem to have been populated, and you would have thought that was a place the Atlanteans might have ended up. But they mainly ended up, it seems to me, in South America, and then although it's not impossible that some of them stayed on Antarctica. Antarctica is a very high altitude land, even though it's been thrust into the polar regions and became polar all year round. It still would have had some parts of it, and they might have had parts of their civilizations, particularly around the Queen Maud areas of Antarctica, which were already, even during the reign of Atlantis, probably considered sort of polar sites in the first place. So those ports were sort of built for the cold weather, and they might have survived for quite a bit of time. And I have been in correspondence with somebody who believes that they have evidence of maps that ancient maps that show trade routes from that part of Antarctica to the Middle East.
Wow!
But that's not published yet. I can't really talk about it. But
fascinating.
Let me just say that there is a possibility that people, even in the dire circumstances of having your whole continent thrust into the polar zone, that parts of your culture, which had been adapted towards the edges of their own polar zone, might have survived. Then you have in the Vedic literature this whole thing about there's this fellow called Tilak. It's on our website as well. Lost Island Paradise of India, and it's called India's Poland's Paradise. If people want to look at that, but Tilak he did I've lost my thought where we're going on that. Oh yes, the idea that there was these sunsets that lasted for days and days and days and days in the Vedic literature. This is what Tilak found. And he became convinced because of this that the Lost Island Paradise had to be near the pole, because that's the only place where you have these sunsets that go on for days and days and days, because they were able to recite the whole Rig Veda, which takes quite a long time to recite, during a sunrise or during a sunset. And that's not physically possible nowadays in an ordinary place. It's only physically possible for you to do that if you are in a polar zone. Now, that could be the north or the south. Tilak chose the north, and I'm just saying it might have been the south.
Beautiful. Fascinating. I just want to ask you one question before we wrap it up. It's about the Prince of Wales Island and the haplogroup DNA.
Oh, yes, right, yes.
This is a key thing for me, too.
Okay, so Prince of Wales Island is an island in British Columbia again, on the west coast, and it's actually in Alaska where they found this, and there was a bear cave there, and archaeologists were doing some research there, and they discovered this body. And when they found the body, it was dated to like 9,000 years ago, which makes it one of the oldest people. And it hit all the newspapers, the oldest Alaskan, and all this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And when they actually began to look into the genetics of it fits most closely with a group of people who live at the very southern tip of South America.
Fascinating.
So and those people also have a very sophisticated language. There's only one speaker left. I mean, we have 2 million American speakers, but this other language, which is his name I forget right now, there's only one person left, I think, that can speak it. And the thing about it is the way this particular language has the capacity to have incredibly large vocabularies that can be built up from smaller words. It's a notion of language that we don't really have nowadays. And so that's another area of investigation that probably needs further exploration by some people, because it's an anomaly to have people living, when Magellan went through the straits of that bear his name, there he saw these, he saw these people living, very primitively, and their fires and etc. But then it turns out they had this extremely sophisticated language, and it's not inexplicable. However, and that area archaeologically starts to show up around 9,600 BC in terms of people. Yeah.
I was talking to somebody recently, I can't remember who, but I think this notion of us crossing the Bering Straits is a bit of a fallacy, and it doesn't really solve a lot of things. I think we could have easily come up the other way, Rand, easily, and that's the Prince of Wales Island and the haplogroup DNA that you were talking about.
Yes. We also have on our website a Peopling of America section that people might want to look at.
Give out your website there, Rand, before we wrap it up.
It's just my name, Flemeth. It's like Fleming, with who takes a bath. FLEM-ATH, Flep.com.
Flemeth.com. And of course, you've got interesting articles there, your biography, your books, and a bit about you section, obviously.
Yeah, well, we just I've had fun with this. Maybe the next time we come back with you, James, I'd like to discuss my most recent research that I've been doing for 10 years now.
Please do, Rand. Please do.
And I won't reveal that yet because it hasn't been published, but it is unrelated to anything I've ever done before.
Oh.
Except that I can say that it's an ancient study, but it isn't about that time period that Atlantis is. It's more recent.
Wow, you've commanded my full attention now, Rand. Definitely, I look forward to that.
Well, I've spent 10 years on it, so
wow. Any idea when that's going to be published, or have you any idea or time frame?
The idea is very controversial. Far more controversial than anything I've done. And we're having difficulty with publishers being willing to stick out their necks to publish it.
It's always the same, Rand.
There are religious overtones.
Wow.
And so we might have to publish it ourselves, and if we do, we'll probably do it next spring.
Sure. Well, I really look forward to that. I really hope you come back and tell us all about that, Rand. That'll be a fascinating discussion, as this has been done. So flem-ask.com is the webpage. I'll obviously have you on the CapricornRadio.com homepage for your own biography and links to your page and extra information. It's been a pleasure having you, Rand. It really has. And thank you again for coming back to discuss this again.
Well, it's a great pleasure to speak with you, James, at all times, and any time you want me on, I will be on, because I just so enjoy talking with you.
Thanks a lot, Rand, and that's a compliment. It really has. You've been a credit to CapricornRadio.com. You really have, and of course, this is my favorite subject, Rand, Atlantis. So, come back anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Regurgitated it, if you like. And people have been trying to understand this because there's peculiar notions in it. A real ocean, a whole opposite continent. These are notions that are very, very, very peculiar.
In a way, Rand, in a way, that's probably not a bad idea that he didn't understand it, because if he was just regurgitating it, he probably would have kept to the facts more than twist or alter some viewpoint that he might have had.
That's my feeling, absolutely. I totally agree with you, James. Without it was their very ignorance that allowed us, because what I'm saying and what I have been saying and Rose and I have been saying, and When the Sky Fell, and then also in the Atlantis Blueprint and Atlantis Beneath the Ice, is that this account is the most sophisticated scientific account of the Earth's geography that we have even as of today. Mm-hmm. It is the most sophisticated. In 2 or 3 sentences, that the description of the entire planet's geography is accurately depicted from the point of view of Antarctica. And that's the thing that throws people off, because we can't imagine looking at the world from Antarctica. But once you start to look at the Earth's geography from Antarctica, then everything that is said in Plato's account makes sense, and I can go through that a little bit if you want.
Yeah.
But that's the bottom line about it.
Well, here's the thing. Let's talk about the parameters and the world ocean and the Egyptian link with Solon and how it was recorded down, because it was recorded by the Greeks, and their worldview, Rand, was different to what our worldview is today, or it'll be different to our worldview in another 2,000 years. So let's get into the Greek worldview and what they were trying to record down, and what that actually means in terms of the evidence.
Oh, sure. The main thing to understand about the Greek worldview is, first of all, they believed that the world was a disk.
Sure.
The world was spherical, but the land part of it was in the northern hemisphere and surrounded by water completely, all north, south, east, west. So, all directions. If you went far enough, you would encounter the same ocean, which they called the Atlantic Ocean. Mm-hmm. Now, so the Atlantic Ocean doesn't just refer to the North Atlantic Ocean like we do in our European-centered view. Sure. It also refers to the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Arctic Ocean. It's the whole ocean. Mm-hmm. So inside that disk are 3 subdivisions. There's Europe, which is pretty well contemporary with what would be Most of Europe, we would. Well, it's pretty similar to what Europe looks like today in terms of geography. But then there had two other features. They had what was called Libya, which we would call North Africa. So it includes all of North Africa, and it's quite a large area. And then what they called Asia, which today we would call the Middle East. So as far as and to the extreme west, there was the Pillars of Hercules, which is the Strait of Gibraltar. Now that has two different meanings. To the map, which you often will see is a map of Atlantis, supposedly in the North Atlantic Ocean. And it's peculiar in the sense that there's a little compass on it that points down, which means that north is down. So you have to turn the map upside down to get our orientation. I came to that map with the concept of, oh, hey, listen, rather than turning the map upside down, maybe we should turn our globe upside down and look at it. And at that time, I came across Charles Hapgood's book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. And in it, for the first time for me, there was a picture of an ice-free Antarctica. And the thing that struck me about it was that Kirker's 1665 map of Atlantis was a remarkably similar map to an ice-free Antarctica. And of course, this is in the book Atlantis Beneath the Ice and on our website under Atlantis in Antarctica. But the thing about it was it seems more than coincidence to me. It seems, because I knew that in 1665, Europeans weren't capable of determining longitude at sea. That didn't happen until the 1770s.
That's the bombshell, Rand. Sorry, Rand. That's the bombshell, isn't it? If this is true, then this is like mammoth. This is a mammoth concept.
Yeah. See, for what it meant to me was that, hey, now there is a piece of physical evidence, this map that Kirker published in 1665, which is a remarkably accurate map of Antarctica without the ice. And we didn't know what Antarctica looked like, even vaguely, about beneath the ice until 1958. That's like 3 centuries after Kirker's book had been published.
That was through radar imaging as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that's using seismic surveys to do it. Now, the maps of Antarctica are getting more and more and more sophisticated.
Sure.
And, of course, you now also have to take into account ocean level as well, because we have a different ocean level now than there was 12,000 years ago when Atlantis was supposed to have existed. So, that was the thing that really got me. It was the Kirker map of Atlantis being what I believe to be an accurate map of ice and ice-free Antarctica. And the south is up is a notion that was common in Egypt. For Egypt, south is the top, ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
We regard the north as up and the south as down. They regarded the south as up because that's where the Nile came from. The water came down from the south to the delta. Mm-hmm. So the top of the world, as far as the ancient Egyptians were concerned, was the south. So south is up. So when you take a globe and start to look at the world from south is up, that is one of the keys to understanding that.
Hi everyone, and you're very welcome to another edition of Capricorn Radio with your host, James Swagger. Today we'll be joined by Rand Flemath, but before we do, a few quick announcements. You can check out the Capricorn Radio Facebook group. It's grown to over 2,200 members now. Follow the links on the Facebook page to discuss the topics on the show. Also follow the links on the CapricornRadio.com homepage. Also there you can see the upcoming guests in the Facebook event section. This Friday we have Chris Dunn, which is tomorrow, and Saturday we have Robert Boval. Really looking forward to finishing this week and getting the shout out there. So let me tell you about today's guest before I bring him on. Rand Flemath is a Canadian writer, librarian and independent scholar. He has co-authored several books with his wife and writer Rose Flemath. She's a novelist and two-time winner of the Canada Council Grant for Fiction. They live in British Columbia, Canada. Let me tell you about Rand's education. He's a BA in Sociology and Anthropology from Simon Fraser University and a Master of Library Science, MLS, from the University of British Columbia. He was mentored by Charles Hapgood from 1977 to 1982, working on the theory of Earth crust displacement, something we're going to get into on the show. And he's a reader at the British Library from 1981 to 1985. He was a senior researcher for the Business International UK Limited, incorporated by the Economists. So without further ado, let's bring on our guest for today. Welcome to Capricorn Radio, Rand.
Well, thanks to be here. Nice to be here, James.
Yeah, and we had such a fascinating discussion last time, and just for the listeners, we lost a 2-hour show, but man, we had such a time last time, Rand.
It was a good time. It was not lost as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think we both learned something from each other and came away kind of a bit more enlightened, and that was fantastic in itself. So yeah, here we are again, and I really appreciate you coming back on the show to redo the show because of the lost files. But so let's get into some of your background, Rand. What got you into this? It always puzzles me when people research Atlantis. I go, what got you into Atlantis? What is it? A mystery? Was there some facts laid in front of you, or was there some sort of anomaly that you've seen, or what's your route in to look for Atlantis, and how does it all come about for you? Like
in one weekend, I've told this story many times, and I don't want it to be overemphasized because I only spent one weekend doing this. But I was writing a science fiction script, and I just came up with the idea of putting Atlantis in Antarctica in the science fiction script. Now, I went off to the library and started to do some research about Atlantis, and that's when it turned from being a script into a research project, which I then continued on for decades. And what I found at the library was a map of Atlantis that was in a book created in 1665. Athanasius Kirker, he was a Jesuit priest living in Rome. And he had access to all the loot that the Romans had taken from the Egyptians. So he found this map, and he reproduced it in a book in 1665. And that book, how Atlantis has been lost to us because of our own worldviews and also the worldviews that we are trying to filter through. Our concept of ancient worldviews are prejudiced by our assumption of our superiority. Mm-hmm. And I believe, and this has been the essential thing that I believe about Plato's account of Atlantis, which he himself regards not as his own invention, but as simply as a story that had been passed through his ancestors, who in turn had taken it from Egyptian priests, who in turn had recorded records from survivors of Atlantis. So the story that is told in Plato's dialogues of Timesius and Critias about Solon, who was Plato's ancestor, going 200 years before the time of Plato, but Solon went to Egypt, and he encountered a priest there and got to him talking about the Great Flood and all the things that had happened in the past. And this priest gives a description. He says, oh, Solon, you Greeks are but children because you remember very little of the ancient past. We, on the other hand, have all these records, and some of our records go back 9,000 years. And so that takes us to 9,600 BC because Solon was in Egypt around 600 BC. So 9,600 BC, because that's an important date to remember.
Very
because
important.
A lot happening at that time. In any case, what happened, and here's the interesting thing. The priest, who I through other research I learned his name was Zonkis, because he was also the tutor to Pythagoras, who was contemporary of Solon. So he taught not he taught Pythagoras for 22 years.
Wow.
He had an encounter with Solon when Solon was visiting in Egypt. Well, and that's where the story of Atlantis begins, as far as we know, is that Zonkus tells Solon about Atlantis, and he says, and he tries to describe where Atlantis is to Solon. But Solon's worldview, which is the ancient Greek world, was pretty limited. So he didn't understand what was said, but he was very good at memory, as all the Greeks were at that time, because this is before the times of writing being popular. Really, writing became very popular with Plato and Aristotle 200 years later. The early pre-Socratic philosophers were oral tradition. So they were very good with their memory. So what Solon did is he recorded this description of the location of Atlantis, and in his memory, passed it on through his ancestors, who eventually came to Plato, who was the first to write it down. Now, even Plato, in my view, didn't understand it. He just agrees. One meaning is the extreme western edge of what we would call the Mediterranean Sea. That's the extremity of it.
Sure.
And that is, and that's one meaning, and that actual strait there. The other meaning was more of a psychological thing. It was the end of the known world.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to go out through those Pillars of Hercules and you didn't know what was out there, that would be daunting, frightening, the unknown back then, you know.
Well, the thing about it, and Plato says it, you know, and so does other Greek writers, poets and stuff. They say, you know, Pindar, for example, says, what lies beyond, we know what he knows. Because what happened is that people would go beyond, but they wouldn't come back. So, you know, that was a barrier. So when we say that Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, it doesn't mean it was to the west. Plato never used the word west, or the Zonkus never used the word west. He said it was beyond the Pillars of Hercules. In other words, beyond the Mediterranean Sea. And so it could just as easily be in the Pacific as it is in the Indian. Okay, so that's the Greek worldview, you know, and what we have now come to in our present day, in our satellite time, what I would call now a scientific point of view, is that I'm going to skip over the European point of view because people probably think they know that, but we'll discuss that a little bit. But let's go right to what is a really scientific point of view of the Earth's the planet Earth.
Sure.
First of all, it's, you know, mostly water, and it's one ocean.
70%, 70% water, which is a lot.
Yeah, and it's a one continuous ocean. If you take a globe and look at Antarctica and ask yourself what ocean it's in, today, using our European concepts, what we've invented is this Antarctic Ocean, which is simply an imaginary barrier, which is the polar zone around Antarctica. And then it's also in the South Pacific, it's in the Indian Ocean, and it's in the Atlantic. So we're thinking of different oceans, but there is, according to oceanographers, and this is what they teach in oceanography today and have been for 20, 30 years, is that the Earth has but one ocean, the world ocean. And this is interesting because in the account that the Egyptian priest gives of the location of Atlantis, he calls the ocean that Atlantis is in by two names. He says it's the Atlantic Ocean, and he also calls it the real ocean. And he says one other thing about it. He says that the Mediterranean is but a bay of this big ocean, a small bay of this big ocean.
Wow. And
all that is true when you start to look at the Earth's geography from a scientific perspective. And because it's not just oceans, there's only one ocean, but we have, in our European-orientated point of view,